Welcome back. I'm sorry it's been so long since I posted my last. Welcome back. I'm sorry it's so long since I posted my last post, but there have been a number of things going on, and I also thought it important to get you a good reference book. So I have a copy here of our book, which is The Truth in the Light. That is a very good reference book, and all the figures that I will be using today will be from it. So I thought that the best thing to do is to begin with the NDE. It's absolutely fascinating. Some of you may have heard that I was so skeptical about the NDE. I knew they didn't occur. They couldn't possibly occur. It was Californian type stuff, all this going into gardens and meeting dead relatives and so on. No, not possible. In fact, I was totally wrong, because into my consulting room came a man with a chronic anxiety state. He'd had it about 4 days, and it occurred after a cardiac catheter had gone wrong. And to his surprise, he found himself out of his body, watching the process of them trying to get his heart restarted and everything. And then he had a standard NDE, going down tunnel, being of light, all that sort of thing. And as he told me about this, I recognized that this was an absolutely genuine experience of his, nothing made up. And that, yes, they did occur in the UK, wasn't only California. And of course, when one starts looking into the literature, one can see, in fact, that they are universal and occur in many other different cultures. And they go right back to the time of Plato, when he describes a man, a soldier from who had been wounded and had an NDE. So even in Greek and Roman times, NDEs are recorded. So they clearly are there. So let's look at the study which we did. Now, it was really just by chance, because I was asked by the BBC if I'd like to take part in a film. In fact, it was a QED film, and it was called Glimpses of Death. And I had a very nice producer, and we went through the whole of the NDE, or what we thought it was at that time. So we got over 2,000 letters following the TV program. This was a huge sample, and it was from throughout the country. And so it was highly unlikely that one would get another sample like that, because at the time that the TV program went out, 98% of the people who wrote into us had no knowledge about the NDE at all. They're rather like me. So from these, we selected 500 of the best ones, which were NDEs, which were clearly NDEs. And then we sent them a questionnaire, which had got, amongst the number of questions, the ones were used by Bruce Grayson to see whether or not one was having an NDE. From that, when I made this slide up, we'd had 350 replies, but in all, we got about 400, just over 400 replies. Now, the circumstances of the NDE in this sample is one hears a lot about heart attacks, but let's just actually look at what we got. A quarter had severe illnesses. Another almost quarter were during operation, and there was 15% had their NDEs during childbirth. Now, that comes to well over half. I just want to draw your attention to the bottom. 20% were people who didn't have anything wrong with them, or anything wrong with their brain. Some of them were very frightened, but otherwise, some of them could have it just sitting in front of the fire. Now, the ones that were serious were the accident group, and that was 10%. And then 9% of our sample had their NDEs during heart attack, and 2% during a suicide attempt. Now, you've probably heard a lot about NDEs and heart attacks. When they occur so frequently in other conditions, why just look at heart attacks? Because we go back to this old problem that you may remember. Is consciousness just generated by the brain, or is it external to the brain and filtered by the brain? And if we could show that during the heart attack, when the heart had stopped and brain functions were down, the NDE occurred, then that would be the one to look at. Because after all, we don't know what's happening in childbirth, what condition the brain's in. During an operation, we should do, but then it'd be under anesthesia. So basically, that was why we chose to look at heart attacks. And a lot of the work we've done has been on patients with heart attacks. Now, what states of consciousness were our sample in? Well, against what you read in the literature, a third of ours were awake, 13% in normal sleep, under anesthesia 14%, and then you come to the serious ones, 17% unconscious and 20% semi-conscious, so that will include the heart attacks and the accidents. And then some were quite clearly confused, but a very small percentage when you come to consider the other causes. So now let's look at the phenomena. You all remember that classically what is described is that you have your heart attack. It's easier to use that as the model. You leave your body when the heart stops and you watch the resuscitation process. And you go down a tunnel, and there is at the end a light, and then you'll go out into this heavenly garden. So those are the numbers. Over 3/4 had peace and calm. 2/3 of ours left their bodies. Only half went down the tunnel. Do notice this. And light was there in 3/4, and the being of light was there in 1/3. So NDEs are very, very variable. And if you take the form that I've given you as occurring in all of them, you'd be quite wrong. Parts of it do, but that's all. So let's start with the out-of-body experience. So let's start with the out-of-body experience. 2/3. So let's start with the out-of-body experience. 2/3 were present. 2/3 had them, but they varied from the very simple to the very complex. So then let's think a little bit about the out-of-body experience and heart attacks. The anecdotal evidence suggests that the OBE occurs during unconsciousness. Well, why do we say that? We say that because people say that they have seen the resuscitation process, and they know what's going on. Dr. Sabom, in a study, found that the OBE, there were correct accounts of resuscitation procedures, much better in those than those who were guessing. So that suggests, again, it's true. And then there's star cases, like a woman whose brain was cooled and she was emptied of blood, so somebody could do something to an aneurysm in their brain. She had an NDE, and again, she described part of the processes. So, is the OBE always truly veridical? Do people make mistakes? Yes, they do, but on the whole, they're much more accurate than not making mistakes. Well, why don't we look at something else? We didn't have any of these cases, but what does the literature say about people who are blind? Well, Kenneth Ring published in '98 a very good patients, which he called Blind Sight in those with near-death experience. And he had 21 cases of blind people. And during their NDE, they regained their sight when they left their bodies. And how do we know that? Because he discussed this with them. And he said that a good description of this was blind sight, because it occurred during the NDE, and they saw better the deeper the experience was. Now that's interesting, because it would suggest that the process of going more deeply into the NDE, if you like, removed some of the barriers so that consciousness outside the brain could be more effective. So it's a very interesting paper, and I would suggest that you looked at it. So here are the phenomena in our study. Pastoral landscapes, about 76%. So that's 3/4, and they would enter a realm of most beautiful flowers. It was the most lovely country garden, an English country garden. And there's no doubt that the place they go to is really beautiful. They say that the flowers have very high color, the scents are amazing, birdsong is very common, and is reported to be sort of angelic in quality. So the landscape they go to is nothing like they've seen before. So it's quite new. And so we have to start asking questions as to what it could be. You walk about in the pastoral landscapes and you may meet dead friends and dead relatives in about a third of cases. So it's not everyone. A life review in only just over 10%. And in the life review, it's enormously interesting, because you're shown sometimes every event in your life, and you can judge it by the life review is extremely interesting. The experiencer is always surrounded by love. His memory for the events is completely comprehensive, and the situation is very realistic. The interesting thing is that you experience the other's pain and the joy you caused the other people by your actions. If you struck them, then you would feel the pain that you caused in them. Now, one of the interesting things is there is nowhere to hide, and everything that you thought and what you did is there for you to see. But there's only one person who does the judging, and it's you. So you judge yourself and criticize yourself if your actions haven't been to the advantage of the other people. So that is the life review. Then 1/4 of people come to a barrier. The barrier can be a stream. It can be just the knowledge if they go further. It can be a road. And they know that if they cross the barrier, then they will die and they won't be able to come back. and 72%, that's 3/4 approximately, uh, are take the decision that they want to come back, with the other quarter uh, being sent back. Now, the decision to return is interesting. There can be reasons like you've just had a baby, so you want to be with it to bring it up, or they can be reasons that you want to help your family. But there can be very strange reasons. We had one patient who came back because she had a pile of ironing for her husband, which she had to do. So the decisions can change from being very simple to complex. And then we come to something which is enormously interesting. That is, when they come back, they have changed, they've transformed themselves. It used to be thought that this was only spiritual, but there's a lot more data on this, and I will, in fact, go into this in more detail later. Let's just look at the cultural difficulties. We're looking at here at a study by Parachito et al. From India, and we're comparing that with studies in the USA. Now, beings of light are more common in India. Religious figures are very much more common in India. Seeing the physical body is more often in out-of-body experiences, as seen in the USA. The life review is more seen in the USA. And being sent back by a loved one is much commoner in the USA. Usually, you'll find your dead mother; she's there. She moves her hands so that you're sent back. In India, you're brought back by a messenger. It's the messenger of the god, and this has been suggested, particularly by Osis and Harrelson, that you could think of it as bungling by the, and Osis and Harrison suggest that this is bureaucratic bungling. Then finally, there are these stigmata which you may have after the NDE, but they're commoner. But the spiritual changes are general. Well, that's a beginning of the NDE, and as you can see, it's much more complex than we normally think of. You remember that they can arise from different states of consciousness, and they can have different pathologies. So we'll need to go into this in more detail if we're to understand them. Next time, we'll take this all a bit further. So thanks for being with me today, and I'll see you next time. Thank you. Bye.